Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. I want first to thank you for making time in your schedule for attending this event. My name is Jason Webb. I serve as the Associate Professor of the USC Shinso Ito Center. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Lowy today as the latest speaker in our the Ito Center LGBTQ Studies Speaker Series. We sponsor this series in hopes that we can bring together various communities, people doing LGBTQ studies, gender studies, as well as Japan studies. And each of those three things can be variously defined, but these are the communities that we hope to reach with these talks. So for today, again, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Lowy. Chris Lowy is a recent PhD from the University of Washington. And this academic year, he has spent at Macalester College. And he's on his way next fall to an assistant professorship at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And so today's topic is early cultural responses to the AIDS crisis in Japan. And why don't we give him I know digitally this is a little even, so let's give him a welcome.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak here at the USC Shinso Ito Center, and for Jason and Shannon for all the help organizing everything. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here in person, and thank you for the kind introduction, and to everyone for taking the time to listen to me speak today. As Professor Webb noted, my name is Chris Lowy, and I'm currently a visiting assistant professor of Japanese at Macalester College in St. Paul. And today I'll be talking about depictions of HIV/AIDS, that is acquired immune deficiency syndrome in Japanese literature and culture from the 1980s and 1990s. So the project you'll be hearing about marks the first attempt in either English or Japanese at studying AIDS literature from Japan in a manner that, one, contextualizes it within the larger category of a global AIDS literature, and two, within gender and queer studies more broadly. As some of you might know, as preventative strategies in clinical treatment for HIV/AIDS have improved in recent years, the traumatic sense of fear and the widespread panic of the early days of the AIDS crisis have become history for those who did not live through them. One consequence has been a decline in the attention paid to so-called AIDS literature, a discipline that examines representations of HIV/AIDS in written texts and popular culture more broadly. While Western AIDS literature is now widely configured as a thematic genre in academic discourse, little has been said about AIDS literature in or from or about Japan. Many Japanese writers only indirectly referenced HIV/AIDS, puzzling critics and readers alike. It should be noted that morality statistics did not inspire the same level of hysteria as we saw in North America and Western Europe. This does not mean, however, that the terror and grief in Japan was not as strong as in the Western world. In this talk, I will discuss how AIDS was described in both popular culture and literature in Japan, discuss how AIDS literature has traditionally been understood, and introduce the AIDS poetry of Ishii Tatsuhiko, all in order to demonstrate how an understanding of an epidemic some of us have already forgotten can actually help us shape a future beyond the current pandemic we are currently living through. So the first question you might ask is, why AIDS literature from Japan? Rethinking AIDS literature from Japan not only serves as a corrective to the limited and often biased research on the topic, but it also helps us detach HIV/AIDS from its primarily Eurocentric gay associations, thus helping us reframe global responses to this ongoing worldwide pandemic. It also provides our students with a valuable tool, the ability to study a contemporary phenomenon from a distance and, in return, use those tools to reflect on our own moment. That is, Representations of HIV/AIDS in literature and popular culture predicted much of the discourse and representations surrounding COVID today. And while HIV/AIDS was and still is regarded as something primarily affecting gay men, both the specific history of AIDS in Japan and the actual relative low risk of contracting HIV allowed it to become something of a phantom disease, always present but rarely revealing itself. This phantomness is not limited to Japan, though. Worst pandemic in century. This is the sort of headline we have grown accustomed to seeing. And at more than 6 million deaths worldwide, it is no surprise why. The pandemic has changed all of our lives in one way or another, and despite a brief respite, will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Though what is lost cannot be recovered, and the emergence of new variants is worrying, with the vaccines comes hope. However, I wanted to show this quote from 2 years ago in order to highlight something else. The comparison between the coronavirus and the Spanish flu, the pandemic it is being compared to, and the epidemic that has been omitted, AIDS. The reason for the omission is purely semantic. While medical professionals usually refer to AIDS as an epidemic, others have critiqued this naming practice. As Peter Sands, the executive director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria remarked just last year, by epidemic, we actually mean a pandemic that no longer kills people in rich countries. By epidemic, we actually mean a disease that the world could get rid of, but hasn't. This omission of AIDS is endemic of the larger cultural amnesia we have for both a long decade of pain, suffering, and death, and one that continues to plague the non-white world. Let us recall that more than 800,000 people have died from AIDS in the United States alone, and the global numbers are even more staggering. To date, more than 34 million people have died from AIDS, the vast majority in Africa. Indeed, the World Health Organization estimates that today, 1 in every 25 adults in Africa is living with HIV. In the United States and other rich nations, though, the fear associated with AIDS has largely dissipated, and the association between gay culture and AIDS is weakening. As an article from just a few months ago notes, more heterosexual people in the United Kingdom are becoming infected by HIV than homosexual and bisexual identifying peoples. Now, granted, this is quite clickbaity. Proportionally, right, when we're thinking in terms of statistics, HIV still affects the homosexual community in a vastly different and vastly greater way than it does the heterosexual community. Nevertheless, the point is clear. The hereto cemented relationship where HIV equals gay equals death is just no longer the case. Furthermore, one predictable consequence of all of this has been a decline in the attention paid to so-called AIDS literature, especially in Japan. Though the limits of the term are clear, it is, for one, largely Western in its usage. When I say AIDS literature, I am borrowing Monica Pearl's characterization of the genre, namely that it broadly refers to fiction that narrativizes AIDS, a type of literature that, through the mechanisms of mourning and melancholia, both forms and reveals shifting identities in response to the epidemic. As Pearl notes, the first AIDS fiction, by and large, was gay fiction. And while writings by women and intravenous drug users would become an integral element of the genre in the West, AIDS literature in Japan was a wholly different space of literary expression that responded to the particular context of the epidemic in Japan. This contextual difference led to two different categories of Japanese AIDS literature. I should also note that I'm not saying that it's limited to AIDS literature from Japan, right? And we can see similar patterns elsewhere. However, in the case of Japan, we see category 1, which I call a literature of mourning, and category 2, a literature of sentimentality. The first resembles Pearl's characterizations of the genre and follows the trajectory of AIDS literature in the West by centering the issue of AIDS squarely within its largely homosexual origins. The second primarily uses AIDS as either metaphor or plot device removed from a gay context. It is usually highly abstract or otherwise created with the intent of eliciting an emotional response. The gulf between a literature of mourning rooted in sexuality and a literature of sentimentality is a large one. The former is constructed as a matter of identity, while the latter is constructed as a matter of misfortune. At its most powerful, the presence of AIDS in the first category of text haunts the narrative in ways that have perplexed Japanese readers and critics, leaving them uncertain about what these texts mean. One reason, and what we'll see in the poetry I discuss later, is because AIDS is left often unnamed. For that reason, an entire corpus of AIDS literature has been left behind in mainstream literary magazines, independently published poetry anthologies, and in reader submissions to gay journals. Such texts are not minor ones necessarily. One can cite, for example, well-known authors such as Tawada Yо, Murakami Haruki, and the poet Ito Hiromi. In much of the literature from the second category, however, that sort of category of sentimentality, AIDS is named but is counterintuitively used in the abstract as an underdeveloped metaphor for something bad, or in many cases, a stand-in for some sort of divine punishment. Jason can talk about this in depth, but it is often understood as some sort of form of karmic retribution. Do something bad and you'll be afflicted by AIDS in your following life. In other words, within the AIDS literature addressed by the small amount of research that does exist on the topic, AIDS as a real thing is almost always absent. Understanding the particular history of AIDS in Japan can help us understand why this might be the case. The first 20 years of the AIDS crisis in Japan can be split into two major waves. The first wave of the 1980s and the second wave of the 1990s. The first wave is said to have begun in July of 1981, marked by an ominous headline in the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's largest newspapers. That headline, which reads, Homo aikosa ni kyoho, has been translated, although I've slightly altered it, by one scholar with tongue firmly in cheek as bad news for homo lovers. Don't be fooled, though. As the following article from 1985 suggests, the rhetoric surrounding this new Black Death was escalating in English, too. Before I go to the next slide, I do want to point out that this is equally as inflammatory in English as it is in Japanese. And this is, luckily, publishing standards have changed. This, though, from 1985, an English headline, reads, medical experts call AIDS the Black Death of the 20th century, but there are differences. The bubonic plague killed only 40% of its victims in Europe. AIDS claims 100%. It is already as serious and devastating a scourge as I can name in memory, said Dr. Anthony Fauci. In Japan, knowledge about AIDS during these early years was largely limited to its association with American gays. It was a popular refrain that since gays in Japan don't engage in the same, quote, hardcore acts that their American counterparts do, they don't need to worry. Spoiler alert, they did and they still do. More egregiously, some pundits, government officials, and even medical doctors would claim that homosexuals didn't exist in Japan, thus the fuss over AIDS was unnecessary. One critic notes that it was around this time in San Francisco and New York that many gays developed the cough that would soon become associated with advanced AIDS. Things would change quickly, though. 3 cases in the 1980s involved straight men contracting HIV, bringing the disease closer to the straight household. It was this encroachment of AIDS into mainstream culture that would incite widespread fear and panic. HIV/AIDS was now a threat to all Japanese, not just the non-existent gay man. By the end of the 1980s, though, this first wave would largely settle down and the sense of panic, at least in popular media, was largely forgotten. Here, for example, I'll show on the next slide, is a short clip from the first episode of Dousoukai, or Classmates. Running for 10 episodes from October to November of 1993, it was the first TV drama in Japan to explicitly feature gay characters in romantic, sexual relationships, and this was a big deal. This went a long way for visibility of gay characters and gay individuals on Japanese TV. The setting is Shinjuku Nichome, which will come up time and time again in today's presentation, the sort of center of Japanese gay life, or at least Tokyo gay life. And a major plot point, which we'll see happen in the next slide or in the next clip, centers around Kazama and Arashi, 2 people who will meet here for the first time. I apologize for the lack of subtitles. It's a short clip, but please just watch and keep an eye on the setting, the idea, and help you develop a sense of what this Shinjuku Nichome is like. Uh-oh. We're not, oh. Let's see.
寒い夏だった。青ざめたように活気の薄い8月であった。
一人どっか店行くの？いや、よく来るの2丁目。いや、案内しようか。悪いけど興味ないんで。あ、そう。ごめん。失礼。
個人がタイプかよ、嵐。
あの顔好きだよ。
そう、お前猿顔じゃん。
一晩ならいいかもしんない。
あれ牛お前いつから老けせんだよ。
のんけのピッチピチサラリーマン一回食ってからやみつきなのさ、僕。
Now, Arashi, the young man in the middle, is clearly smitten. Such representation in mass media was an important step in the history of gay visibility in Japan. However, the fear of AIDS, which was everywhere in the real Shinjuku, is conspicuously missing from the entire television series. It is a lacuna. We can infer from the actual sense of fear permeating, Shinjuku by turning our attention to gay magazines from the time, all edited, published, and largely centered in that same Shinjuku space. So it's a fictional program filmed in the actual Shinjuku, and this is where all of these real magazines would have been published. For example, the advertisement for lubrication seen here on the right, which boldly, and I need not tell you, erroneously claims that, quote, it is the only thing that can protect you from AIDS, ran at the very least from 1990 through 1992 in Barazoku, Japan's largest gay magazine and repository of gay comic books, fiction, and poetry. I say at the very least ran from these dates because I have yet to carefully catalog and survey text from magazines from the time, but I'm sure its runtime was longer than that. It was also around this time that Barazoku was running PSA-like announcements instructing readers, teaching readers how to wash and reuse condoms in order to stop the spread. This too was gravely incorrect advice. In the same issue from 1992, here, this one from 1992, Ito Bungaku, the longtime editor of Barazoku, who was himself straight, gave this dire warning to readers. Quote, at any rate, all you can do is try not to contract HIV. Even if you catch it in Tokyo and get sick here, the reality is that there aren't many hospitals that'll see you, and their beds are filled to capacity anyway. Each and every one of you should be aware of the fact that if you contract HIV, you're going to experience something truly horrible. Don't give in to a single moment of passion. You're guaranteed to tumble into a pit of despair, end quote. And it was around this time that the second wave of the AIDS panic would begin. The catalyst this time was the infamous Yakugai scandal. Yakugai, which means a drug-induced toxicity, refers to the occurrence of HIV/AIDS among Japanese hemophiliacs, approximately 1,800 of whom contracted the virus from imported blood products prescribed to control their bleeding disorder, end quote. As early as 1984, several hemophiliacs were discovered to have been infected with HIV through the use of untreated blood preparations. Of some 4,500 hemophiliacs in Japan, nearly half contracted HIV in the 1980s. And while they contracted HIV in the 1980s, this fact was concealed from the public for nearly a decade. It is not difficult to imagine how the image of AIDS in Japan during this second wave meant two different things at once. On the one hand, it became a symbol of a sentimental, romanticized death associated with innocent victims. At the same time, and on the other hand, when it came to gays, AIDS represented death brought upon by one's own lack of self-discipline, and supposed amoral lifestyle. Fiction from this time reflects this split, but it is only the sentimental or abstract variety that has been read in AIDS literature. Recall that this is also the genre, the type of AIDS literature that sort of forefronts AIDS in its literature, in its literary texts, despite doing so in a very abstract manner. So what does the sentimental sort of AIDS literature look like? There are generally 4 pieces of fiction published between 1981 and 1994 that represent the genre, all shown here. The first 2 represent highly abstract depictions of AIDS, while the latter focus on individuals who contracted HIV through the aforementioned tainted blood transfusions or who contracted it after being sexually assaulted. I call them the canon because these 4 texts have been studied as a set in the limited and very few studies that have been conducted on AIDS literature from Japan. I should be clear here before I continue. I don't think that literature ought to put limits on who may or may not speak on a given topic or anything like that. The problem with this particular literature, though, is that HIV/AIDS is used exclusively as a plot point removed from its real-life context. And while these 4 texts comprise the canon, there are other similar ones to point to. 3 examples taken at random include the 1987, very early, Red Ice Age by Matsumoto Seicho. Yes, that Matsumoto Seicho, he was still alive. This text has been described as, quote, a futuristic thriller set in Germany charting the extermination of the human race through a hybrid of flu and HIV. There's also the 1988, The Empire of Feminism by Murata Motoi, in which women are imagined to be immune to HIV. And perhaps, to a lesser degree, the well-known takedown of literary theory by Tetsuya Yasutaka, called Professor Tadano of the Department of Literature. Interestingly enough, and it's unfair to kind of put it in this category, but 1988 also marks what I can tell to be the first substantial treatment of HIV/AIDS in manga, Japanese comic books. That manga, called Tomoe, is pictured here on the right. It's actually a fairly delicate, a pretty delicate depiction of a not very well understood disease. This sentimental treatment of AIDS is consistent with larger cultural trends too, and persisted well throughout the 1990s. Take, for example, the television drama Kami-sama mo Skoshidake, or Please God, Just a Little More Time. Airing in late 1998, the protagonist contracts HIV through the practice of compensated dating, which was a very big cultural phenomenon, cultural issue at the time. And the narrative focuses largely on the life she could have lived, right? We sort of have the sentimental imagining of the future. As I argue shortly, though, AIDS itself could be replaced with anything. It is simply used as a metaphor for stolen time. This metaphorical use of AIDS, despite how tempting it must be for an author looking to move their readers, is a dangerous and irresponsible tactic that erases those actually suffering from the disease. As Susan Sontag famously argued in both Illness as Metaphor and in her later AIDS and its Metaphors, when illness and disease is used primarily for its metaphorical power, the power of the metaphor is always transferable to something new. It is reductionist in its functionality because it does not confront the disease, but uses the disease as a vehicle for eliciting an emotional response. Put a bit more crassly, one hallmark of this literature is that it need not be AIDS that the protagonist suffers from. In the case of Japan, it could very well be leprosy, tuberculosis, cancer, or even more recently, COVID. All illnesses well represented in the Japanese literary imagination and at one time used for their metaphorical powers. The literary representation of these diseases, I should also say, vary greatly from, for example, radiation poisoning resulting from the nuclear bombs, Minamata disease, and most recently, the 2011 nuclear fallout in Fukushima. I'm not saying that every treatment of each of these diseases neatly fits into these categories, right? That's an impossible claim to make. But in terms of general tendencies, we find certain things are easier to talk about than others. And the way we talk about them and the way we treat them tends to fall into certain patterns. Indeed, as in some of the most powerful literary depictions of disease, not naming the affliction, interestingly enough, can often be incredibly powerful. This is the case with the AIDS poetry of Ishii Tatsuhiko. Ishii Tatsuhiko is known as a poet's poet, regarded by some as one of the best writers of tanka alive today. Few of his works, though, have been translated into English, and I suspect it is because of not only their content, but of their style. And I'll talk about style in a second. The texts I will discuss with you today are actually two series of tanka entitled Yokohama and Bathhouse, respectively. Tanka, as many of you know, is a traditional form of Japanese poetry consisting of 31 syllables. It's a much more complicated art form than that, but we'll keep it simple for today. Both Yokohama and Bathhouse came out in 1992 and were originally published in a short-lived coterie journal called Sanzo. It's a very, not a widely circulated journal, but it included luminaries such as, well, probably the most famous would be Inuhiko Yomota. Going back, let's look at some of the poems. I mean, going back and recalling this year, 1992, it marks the beginning of the second wave of the AIDS crisis, of the AIDS panic in Japan. And it is contemporaneous with both the Japanese drama we watched together, right, running through Shinjuku Nichome, and the gay journals I cited talking about lotion being the only way to prevent yourself from contracting HIV. Though a lot of these poems were often set in that same Shinjuku, Ishii's poetry couldn't be more different. Ishii deals explicitly with the sexual practices of gay men, especially at various commercial sex venues, such as the eponymous bathhouse. These spaces function as actual physical places as well as abstract metaphorical ones. In this early set of poems, we've yet to arrive at the bathhouse. Instead, we're confronted with verses of motion and scenes of sexual energy hidden in plain sight. A cursed sleep, a man places on that shoulder the head of an unfamiliar man. Riding the subway, words in my ear, love thy neighbor. In a crowded train, people secretly connected, eye to eye, hand to penis. What have they come to see, crowding only the back seats of a cramped movie theater? In poem 1, for example, we imagine two post-coital lovers, one of whom has fallen asleep on another. But why is the sleep cursed? It might be the inherent loneliness of a one-night stand, or perhaps it is the looming sense of death that will creep into the poetry collection. Poems 2 and 3 jolt us into motion, perhaps on our daily commute to work, with a reference to the Gospel of Matthew thrown in for good luck. Poem 4 is set in a movie theater, a well-known setting for anonymous sex, especially in the various shitamachi or downtown areas of Tokyo. It is the bathhouse, though, that Ishii, what Ishii will elsewhere call an akusho, or a bad place, that is at the center of these poems. What makes a bathhouse a bad place anyway? The term refers to two things at once. First, it is a reference to the Turkish baths that were and are commercial venues for men to go to for casual sexual encounters. Such venues were sources of great controversy and consternation during the AIDS crisis, often configured as spaces of self-indulgent behavior that did nothing but speed up and spread HIV. Indeed, many such bathhouses throughout the United States and Europe were raided by police and permanently shut down during this time. Such spaces are regularly featured in AIDS literature and gay-focused literature more generally. One contemporary example occurs in Deadline, a recent novel by Chiba Masaya that opens with a scene at a contemporary bathhouse in Japan. Chiba, by the way, was right here, probably in the same seat a few years ago. Also, this was probably a week before he came down to visit me in Miami. It's a fun connection. But the second, and more particularly Japanese context, a bathhouse refers to the onsen, or public bath, that is ubiquitous to modern Japanese society. The reference to the bathhouse tethers Ishii's tanka to Japan's literary past and its preoccupation with pleasure quarters and bathing, especially in the popular literature by, for example, 19th century author Shikite Samba. It is this constant wrestling between the past and the present and the juxtaposition of one on top of another that creates the tension between a physical reality and what can be called a literary impossibility. Where exactly are these poems located and when do they take place? The connections between, and we'll talk about this more, but the connections between HIV/AIDS and the culture of the Edo period is not limited to Ishii either. The Edo-inspired AIDS series by Masami Teraoka, a Japanese national living in the United States, illustrates the sensuality associated with the bathhouse and a fear of HIV afflicting homosexual relationships. I have to thank David Lurie for introducing this artist to me a while back. It's been very helpful and very fruitful. Alison Bling notes that Teraoka, who was a Japanese-born, American, heterosexual male, HIV-negative artist living in Hawaii, shocked the art world when he began his AIDS series in 1985. Alongside artists such as Keith Haring, Barbara Kruger, and Felix Gonzalez-Torres, he confronted AIDS as a profound personal concern with global implications that could affect anyone. In this painting from 1987, a geisha is bathing in preparation for meeting a client, but is having trouble opening a condom package. The dialogue, which in part reads "kondom ga tonde yuku yuku," meaning the condoms are flying away, is a play on words. Where yuku can also mean to orgasm, it suggests the inability for her to open the condom package in time will, in a sense, lead to unprotected sex. If the suggestion of death is only alluded to here, and you're thinking of criticizing me as being reading too much into it, the next image is unmistakable. As an exhibition label from the Smithsonian American Art Museum notes, here, you can see down here, a geisha preparing for a night of love tears open a pack of condoms as a former client, now reduced to a fleshless cadaver, crawls through her door. He complains that he took a subway to get there and says, "I felt bad on the train because everybody was afraid of me." We'll look more at the work of Teraoka in a second, but returning to our poetry, one aspect of Ishii's tanka that deals with this tension between the past and the present, between the Edo period and Japan of the early 1990s, is perhaps surprisingly the archaic style they are written in. By style, I don't mean the poetic form itself of tanka, right? But the language he uses. Between his use of uncommon Chinese characters, classical grammar, and difficult vocabulary, his poetry is decidedly not user-friendly. I would say that for many educated Japanese, it would be, or native speakers, or those who have studied Japanese for a very long time, his poetry is often difficult to read. Not many people would be able to read hisagu like this. But on a dark road in the afternoon light, a soldier with golden hair stands tall and pisses. Clouds scatter into the deep of the blue sky. A young boy stands in order to sell away his youth. Turning around, the sea is stormy. What crime is there to the one tugging the sleeves of soldiers from abroad? The language here confuses the reader. Again, when do these poems take place? Should we imagine Commodore Perry arriving on Japan's shores in 1853, visiting an island that does not know it has just begun to modernize? Or is this a reference to the numerous military bases still in operation today? Recall that one of the titles from this time, one of the collections of tanka from this time, is Yokohama. Does it even matter? Here, and indeed throughout the poetry collection, the past and present seem to conflate and, in the next instance, diverge. The language is archaic. Yubari, the word for piss, is marked, and totsukuni, the word used here for abroad, is not frequently encountered today. Left unannotated, hisagu, meaning to sell, is unreadable for most readers. The style here also suggests a time just before Western cultural norms would transform the pre-modern practice of male-male sex into the taboo act it is today. The shadow of change, however, is on the horizon. The interlocutor asks, what is the crime, the sin of sex work, implying a present awareness of its absurdity. With this, too, the careful reader is jolted to the present by the long shadow cast by AIDS. It was debated and suggested that Japan's patient zero was a female sex worker. It was reported that she was, quote, a 22-year-old habitual prostitute that had sexual intercourse with a number of men, including non-Japanese. How much does xenophobia shape our reactions and perceptions to pandemics? Of course, if COVID tells us anything, a lot. Teraoka too is interested in this relationship. Quoting Bling again, this painting by Teraoka depicts an international ghost story. Here, he revisions the 1854 arrival of the American Navy in Japan for the age of AIDS. Residents of the local pleasure quarters lingering over lunch are rudely interrupted by the appearance of Commodore Perry's black ships on the monster-infested waters, and a ghost with big plans for his shore leave drifts in to startle a geisha who is not prepared for this special customer. The group hastily tears open condoms, even though the suggestive smoking cannon in the upper left, you can see it up here, suggests that it may be too late to prevent unprotected penetration. And it's not difficult to graph this metaphor of being too late to a sort of relationship between Japan and the United States during the Edo period as well, the end of the Edo period. Back in the bathhouse, though, things are grim. If you are to die of love, you should all the more because this is passing, one-night love. They turn to look, again, they turn to look as they pass in the hall, soul so lonesome. Is life not full of blame? Head hanging and deep in thought, someone asleep on a chair. Not understanding the spatial components of the bathhouse or the conventions of the venue would, for example, render poem 2 incomprehensible. Here, two men pass each other in a cramped hallway, only glancing back to see if his interest is reciprocated. This is an act of communication, a signal to the other man of interest. If the other returns the look, then they are off to the races. If not, he will keep on walking. The again here is both a reference to the numerous glances behind the head and the fact that this mating ritual has occurred numerous times. The surrender to carnal temptation that Ito Bungaku, the editor of Barazoku, warned his readers against is here in full display. The difference is here, though, is that it is both conscious and volitional, and there is an undeniable sense of death. There's an undeniable sense of death, but also an excitement contained within them, the thrill of the hunt. The feeling, which might be described as a celebration of life juxtaposed with the fear of death, contains an element of hope. That is, if these poems of a past superimposed on a contemporary reality can contain some hope, how then can we consider this particular form of hope? Though I'm still thinking through the issue, the work of the late Jose Esteban Munoz has proven to be a useful springboard. Munoz sees hope in the potentiality of a queer future located in the quotidian or everyday. This potential, significantly, is in one way unlocked by visiting the past. In Munoz's 2009 Cruising Utopia, in which he describes his concept of the utopia in great detail, he meditates on the idea of a utopia and how it can be applied to readings of queer literature, especially texts that extend into and beyond the AIDS crisis. His very important work starts with Frank O'Hara and continues to the 1980s, 1990s. The utopian, of course, is a concept that often derided as a fanciful and ultimately impossible endeavor. However, Munoz argues that, as a practice, utopias allow for certain minority populations to envision a perfect world in which they wish to belong. That is, through encounters with the past and the traces they leave behind, one can imagine a future removed from what is sometimes referred to as straight time. Literary encounters with the past provide us with moments of reimagining the present and ultimately the future. Ishii's poetry, set both in a pre-modern aesthetic and a contemporary commercial sex venue with the shadow of AIDS looming, always has one eye in the past and another on the future. Munoz views this approach as an important corrective to what Eve Sedgwick famously called paranoid readings. In contrast to a paranoid reading, Munoz's attempts a reparative one, one rooted in his understanding of a utopia. Simply put, thinking about the past from the present can help us reimagine our future. Recall the set of poems discussing a soldier with golden hair, standing tall and urinating. Is this Ishii's reimagining of a lost Japan at the precipice of modernity? Is this him inviting the reader to return to a moment in the past that would enable us to renegotiate the terms of their relationship with the rest of the world and, through such means, reimagine Japan's role in the future? This painting by Teraoka, entitled Condom Trade Wars, recasts the economic and political relationship between the United States and Japan from the moment those black ships arrived on Japanese shores. The, quote, soldier with golden hair, in fact, was likely on this ship or on a similar one. A paranoid reading might understand these moments as one steeped in nationalism and xenophobia. Another reading, though, might view these moments as an invitation to imagine a future utopia by returning to the past and reconsidering, rethinking, and reimagining those initial conditions. This possibility for utopia, I imagine, is to be found in much of the AIDS literature from Japan and demands our attention. And perhaps therein lies one of the great powers of reading AIDS literature today. Not only are we preserving these important stories, but we benefit from them in that they help us reshape our futures. I'm going to wrap up here, but we can understand most of the poetic moments created by Ishii as ones existing simultaneously in the past, present, and future. In the past, because the style of his tanka suggests a time before the norms of the present were codified. This returning to the distant past affords us the opportunity to imagine a present different from our own, one in which things might have worked out differently. Following Munoz's logic, this return to the past is also an opportunity to reimagine our future. The same holds true of the work of Teraoka, which we also looked briefly at today. As we think about how our lives will look in a post-COVID world, if such a thing is possible, reflection on the AIDS crisis and how we responded to it is of the utmost importance. I need not remind you that many of the same characters are still in play, right? That quote from 1985 by Anthony Fauci at least highlights that. As the generation of people who lived through the AIDS crisis is quickly shrinking, it is with grave urgency that we should confront this history head on. AIDS literature from Japan existed, it is complex, and it has a lot to tell us about how we experience the world around us. Not only that, a serious consideration of AIDS literature from Japan will help develop our understanding of the way the rest of the world, the non-European, non-American world, responded to the AIDS crisis. And it's just one small step, one small contribution to that much larger and still continuing ongoing story. I'll go ahead and stop here, but thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We appreciate that very rich and complex talk. I'm sure that participants have things that they would like to ask. We can give people a minute to catch their breath and organize their thoughts. And I guess we'll be accepting the questions on via the Q&A. And so if you want to submit that, then I will read it, or will the questioner actually have a chance to read? I'll read it. Okay, so as they come up, I will read it. Meanwhile, we can take any other questions. Larry, you look like you want to go for it.
I had a couple, but
Sure.
I'll leave myself to one for now. I was kind of curious so I guess nowadays, so I'm trying to frame this properly. I was curious if you encountered in the stories that you talk about here, any eroticization of the disease itself as something that could be seen as, I guess, sexual or interesting, which I guess the current term for it would be bug chasing in the kink community. But if it was already present in some of the literature.
I haven't seen much, bug chasing or eroticization, fetishization of I mean, essentially, right, liberation through contraction, right? I haven't seen much of that. Not saying it doesn't exist, but it really would have been kind of highly taboo in Japan. I mean, it is to a certain extent in the US as well too. But interestingly enough, I don't know if I would call it eroticization, but what we see a lot is a romanticization of HIV in the critical community. And what I mean when I say the critical community, I'm thinking of like, you know, literary critics who are writing about HIV/AIDS. There's quite famously a taidan, it may have been a teidan between Asada Akira, Karatani Koji, and one other person, who Karatani basically says that he lost all interest in AIDS when he found out that it wasn't something that just sort of naturally emerged from within the body. Once the secrets of AIDS were uncovered, of HIV was uncovered, he lost all interest in it. And we oftentimes, especially in some of the more abstract HIV/AIDS literature from the very beginning that we see, like Shimada, its mystery is what was romantic to a lot of intellectuals thinking about it. In terms of from within the queer community, I don't know too much about it, but I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a famous anthology of early AIDS literature called High Risk. It came out. It was translated into Japanese maybe 2 years after it came out into English, which is incredibly, incredibly fast. So there must have been some audience for this. Yeah, yeah, certainly.
Chris, you have a question from, forgive me if I mispronounced the name, Davinder Bhowmick?
Devinder, yeah.
Devinder.
Hello.
Devinder, beg your pardon.
That's all right.
So I'm going to read the question. The numbers you gave of death by AIDS in Africa are staggering. Are you aware of AIDS as a literary theme in writing by anyone from any of the many countries in Africa?
Yeah, it is truly a staggering number, and I have a list that I will get to you. I will send to you, Devinder, addressing some of them. What's so interesting about reading or thinking about AIDS literature, although it's interesting enough, what's interesting to sort of note here is that when we say AIDS literature, we're almost never talking about AIDS literature from Africa. The term sort of within the literary world, and this is part of the problem, almost exclusively refers to literature in the Western world talking about and dealing with AIDS, particularly because the manifestation of AIDS in Africa is so very different from the way it is manifested and the way it exists in the US. And so the experiences are completely different, as is primary means of spreading. And so I will send you a list of some places to take a look at, but thank you for the question.
You have another one from John Treat, who asks, would you care to comment on the frequency that infected young women appear in Japanese AIDS literature?
Yes, this is also a very interesting question. I guess part of it will depend on what your definition of literature is, but the contraction of HIV/AIDS through sexual assaults and that compensated dating is incredibly common in the Keitai Shousetsu, or the cell phone novel. And it very much fits neatly within that larger trajectory of sentimental literature. But even that piece by Setouchi Jakucho, which I brought up, Life and Death, features young women, and more often than not, when they appear, it is through more sort of sentimental means. Yeah, but they are very well represented.
Questions are streaming in now, so
Okay.
Let me make quick work of this so that we can get to everyone's. Taku Hattori says, thank you for the lecture. You had mentioned, quote, AIDS literature existed in Japan in the past tense. Does this mean that AIDS literature doesn't exist as much in recent years, specifically 2000s onward? Or is there a specific time period where you draw a line?
Yeah, and that's also, yeah, it's really very, very worth thinking about. A lot of it will come down to arbitrary definitions and, lines where we stop things. Certainly the flavor of AIDS literature, when we think about it sort of at its peak, right? We're thinking Angels in America and that sort of thing, the 80s and 90s, has the nature of the way AIDS is discussed and talked about in literature anywhere, or at least in the English-speaking world and in Japanese, has changed. And so I think a more conservative answer would say that, we probably draw the line, we sort of create the boundary of AIDS literature, or imagine it for the most part ending, or at least, fundamentally changing with the development of medication like Truvada or PrEP, which can, for the most part, almost 100%, we won't say 100%, but nearly 100% prevent the transmission of HIV and reduce HIV viral loads to undetectable levels, which for the most part would cease its transference. In terms of contemporary depictions of HIV/AIDS in literature, I just don't see it as much in literature written in Japanese and coming from Japan. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. Certainly it does. But in terms of the sense of fear and the palpable fear that was associated with it in the 80s and 90s, I just don't see it as much. Of course, if anyone has examples, I would very much enjoy taking a look at it.
Okay, thank you. I'll just zip right ahead. Diana, and Diana, I apologize. Is it her or her?
Diana, yes.
Diana.
Her.
So she says, Professor Lau, you said it was the quote mystery of AIDS that drove a lot of people / critics to romanticize it. Do you think this could be a reason why, or add to why, AIDS literature has dwindled or become less popular?
I have to think about that for a second. I think so. I think a lot of that has to do, I think there's a certain inherent attraction. There's a desire to romanticize something that's unknown, that's a mystery. And once that mystery is solved, I think that attraction disappears quite quickly. And so, yeah, I guess I would say that, yes, I think that's one reason why AIDS literature has dwindled or become less popular. I should say it's not that it doesn't exist anymore. There is literature. John Treat has written a very good, short but a good article talking about this, about AIDS literature that is still being written. But certainly as a genre, as a sort of a movement that captured an ethos, it no longer, in my mind, has the same impact, the same power, the same punch that it once did. And this isn't necessarily because the mystery dissolved, but because medical advancement, right, allowed these things to be more contained.
I feel like we're working very hard, Chris, but I'm just going to keep on with questions if that's okay.
Can I get some coffee?
Oh, yeah.
I feel like I'm on it. 1 second. Yeah,
that's good.
Just 1 second.
No, I totally get it.
My throat. I feel like, yeah. I have my notes. All right. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. So our next question is from Kirsten Sufer.
Yeah.
Thank you for an amazing talk. Can't wait to hear more. Could you please say a little bit about how, quote, sentimentality in depictions of AIDS might vary by media and or genre? I am thinking perhaps how TV drama, fiction film, and documentary might offer different ways of approaching the topic, as well as, for example, SF, manga, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and it's something that honestly I would like to. That's probably going to be the next stage of this project, is really doing a full scale survey of a variety of genres, right? I'm interested in, I cite TV stuff, I'm interested in poetry, I'm interested in manga, and the treatment will be different between genre, but more often than not, it depends, I think, on publication venue. You know, who is the intended audience? One of the things that I didn't really talk about too much today, but like with that poetry, that tanka by Ishii, when I was asking, where are these poems set? I was also implicitly asking, who are these poems for? I mean, who can, not only is an incredibly high context poems that, you know, require knowledge of classical classical Japanese, sort of pretty intense readings of pretty high reading ability of Chinese characters and all that stuff. But it also requires intimate knowledge of the physical structure of a bathhouse. Otherwise, these don't mean anything, right? It doesn't really constitute meanings to the majority of readers. And so I think there is a tendency for the more specialized a text becomes, whatever sort of genre it is, the more likely it is to become less sentimental. Like there may be a trajectory there. There are quite a few documentaries, TV shows, manga that are, they're anticipated to reach a wide audience, and the wider they are, the more sentimental they tend to become. It's a very cursory answer, and again, there's always going to be there are always going to be exceptions, but I think it's a really interesting way to think about these different texts, right? All these different categories. We can categorize them by genre, but we can also categorize them by intended audience and the way in which sentimentality is used and to what degree. So thank you for that question.
Here's another from Yukiko Hanawa. Are there any works similar to, say, Sarah Schumann, who crossed paths with many of us lesbians / dykes, parenthetically, of a certain age, for whom AIDS pandemic transformed feminist, lesbian, radical politics and our relationship to gay men?
Yeah, in Japanese, none that I'm aware of. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. It just means that I'm not aware of them. I mean, rough equivalents to literature by, say, Rebecca Brown or something like that. I'm not aware of. It's something that I would like to, and actually, if I have the opportunity, something I would like to do is survey lesbian journals of the time, the 80s and 90s. But those are even more difficult to obtain than gay journals at the time, which are already difficult to get a hold of. And so it is on my list. I view it as a very important question, but one that I've been unable to answer as of yet. Because those relationships, it's never, and this is, I hope it came across today, but something that I do try to stress is that it's never just about gay men. Who was there taking care of these men dying? It was often their family. It was often their, female friends, their lesbian friends, those members of the community. And so recording that story in the case of Japan is also incredibly important to me.
Here's a question from Nobuko Yamasaki. At this time of living with HIV, as well as the development of technology, would you care to speak about reproduction, baby making by parents with HIV?
Nobuko, I'm going to say that I do not know enough about the topic to comment on it sufficiently, but it's something that I think that is important, and it's something that I will look into. So thank you for that.
Here's one from Matthew Fraley. He asks, does the use of traditional characters or classical locutions characterize Ishii's oeuvre as a whole, or is it specific to Yokohama and Bathhouse?
Yes. So on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. So a very evasive answer. And what I mean by that, Matthew, and if you haven't looked at Ishii's poetry, I'd love to send you some. Not only, it actually may be more appropriate to characterize Ishii's poetry as, we can call it Japano-modernist, in that he is heavily influenced by Pound, right? And so not only is it, not only does he incorporate classical syntax, grammar, kanji, itaiji, that sort of thing into it, but in other poems, we'll see Russian, Hebrew, Greek interspersed within them. And he is definitely going for this modernist. He quotes Pound and Eliot numerous times. So he's definitely aware of a larger tradition that he's working in. And so I think his use of the classical, even though the vast majority of his poetry, of his tanka, is written in the classical language, Bathhouse and Yokohama specifically make great use of even Sanskrit. Outside of Bathhouse, though, I believe that the vast majority of his tanka is, I would call it, in my language, I would call it highly visual. There's just an exceptional use of ateji, of furigana removed from the ateji function. We have a lot of itaiji, classical characters, yeah. So it definitely is characteristic of his larger work, but within Bathhouse itself, it's far more chaotic. That sort of modernist aesthetic is much stronger there.
Very good. We have another question. What percentage of HIV literature was created during the heart of the crisis as opposed to afterward?
I guess that would depend on which, what are you considering the heart of the crisis? We don't have any, to the best of my knowledge, I should say, right? We don't have any incredibly early stuff, but by the late 1980s, we see stuff in Japanese. We don't get a lot of what we might see in English, right, where there's this sort of new disease that's afflicting gay men, right, that hasn't been named yet. Mostly because the numbers just wouldn't have reflected that reality in Japan for the most part. But in terms of when, I think we'd see it by the late 1980s, certainly.
Caleb Run asks, or first states, thanks for the lecture. How has the early depiction of AIDS in Japanese literature made impacts in media outside of Japan?
I would say it hasn't. There hasn't been too much. However, right, it depends what we want to define as Japan. Those paintings, those Teraoka paintings that I showed, were painted by Teraoka after he had left Japan and for a decidedly non-Japanese audience. That had not been translated into English. In Murakami's UFO, despite not mentioning AIDS once. I don't think that there's any sort of conspiracy as to why it hasn't been translated. I don't think Murakami would care one way or the other. But it's interesting that that is the one piece that hasn't been translated into English.
I'm going to continue with the theme of Teraoka's art.
Oh yes,
Just mention it. This is from Mariko Takano. And she asks, thank you for a great talk. Do you think Teraoka's art works were targeted towards an American audience or a Japanese audience? Curious to see them vis-a-vis the Japanese, the Japan-US relationship of the late 1980s.
Yeah, this is an easier question to answer. It seems that it's undoubtedly geared towards Americans, or at least non-Japanese. However, it's incredibly well. You could see it's incredibly well done. It is not thrown together by any means, right? It's masterful. But I think the idea definitely is to have an American audience in mind. One of the reasons we know this, or we can imagine this, we can posit this, is because some of the earlier works by Teraoka, indeed ones that made him famous before his AIDS series, was ukiyo-e paintings that included topics like McDonald's and fast food. And so he's really thinking about the Americanization of Japan. Mm.
On that point, I'm actually gonna, sorry to you, I'm skipping around a little bit to try to be thematically coherent. Matthew Fraley asked another question about, the piece says, this is a very interesting reading of implications of 1853 to 1854 black ships and these materials. Is the immediate post-war occupation also being invoked in Ishii's tanka?
I think in Ishii's tanka, yes, absolutely. Certainly, one collection is titled Yokohama, right? And so we are always thinking, we're always sort of imagining both Commodore Perry, we're imagining the post-war, we're imagining all of that at the same time. And so I think that reading is very much there. And he often talks about the renga, the bricks and all that sort of stuff. And so the image of a very contemporary Yokohama, I think, is also being juxtaposed, being superimposed on his poetry as well. And that's a whole other area of a whole other layer of imagery that is worth being, I think, teased out of these poems as well.
Got a few more, but I'm going to give you a chance to sip your coffee if you need it.
I've already finished this. Yeah, I've already finished this one.
All right, so this is from Marco.
Okay.
In current times, what form of media would you consider to be the most impactful catalyst that educators or healthcare providers can use to reach or educate the population on HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention?
Probably TikTok. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, really anything that, and I would imagine that, if we're talking about, I mean, I guess it really is community specific, right? And what community we're talking about specifically. I think even in, sex education courses, these things are incredibly important to talk about. But I think in terms of media, TikTok, Instagram, of course, there are hookup apps, right? A lot of the bathhouse aesthetic that we've been talking about today has been digitized and is now available in most people's hand. I mean, one thing that, and this goes back to that question of the distinction between epidemic and pandemic, but one of the things that is very, it's a positive development, but in the United States, it's almost impossible for you to, I shouldn't say that, but it's very difficult for you not to be able to receive Truvada or PrEP free of charge, right? There's almost always some sort of supplementation available to you. And so it's a matter of getting that information out to communities in effective ways that don't sort of look down on people, which I think can turn a lot of people off. But that's a different type of conversation. Yeah.
All right, this is one from Yoshihiro Yasuhara. I'm interested in the intersectionality of AIDS literature as you found in the works of Tawada Yoko, Ito Hiromi, and Murakami Haruki. From a different perspective, how would you see the genre in the context of social justice and literature?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I never really thought about it too much. In terms of literature, I honestly, if I'm being honest, I very rarely see intersection of social justice and literature in literary text and fiction to be incredibly, I don't want to say I don't find it effective, but it's functioning in a different way. But I would point to, for example, those that classmates, right, Dosokai, that clip we watched, as a form of social justice in a very different way than we're using that term today. But it was a big deal to have these characters depicted on mainstream Japanese TV, and I'm sure there were lots of backroom discussions before it happened. Similarly, I would say that someone whose name didn't come up today, but Tagame Gengoro, who the well-known gay manga artist, his my brother's husband, right, Ototo no Oto, is a form of social justice. It was, so Tagami Gengoro, for those of you who don't know, is certainly East Asia's most well-known gay manga artist, and he's still very active today. And he is incredibly hardcore, like, don't Google him. But about 5 years ago, he published a manga called My Brother's Husband, My Younger Brother's Husband, My Little Brother's Husband, Oroto no Oto, which depicted in an asexualized manner the relationship between two, not only gay men, but well, one gay man and his twin brother. It's a whole thing. It's a manga thing. But one of them was Canadian, one of them was Japanese. And so not only discussing same-sex relations in Japan today, but also thinking about it from the lens of international relationships and that sort of thing. I think that's a form of social justice. With the literary texts I cited, Murakami, Ito, and Tawada, certainly Ito Hiromi is the one that has most sort of social justice consciousness at its strongest. Yeah, and her work, quite famously, of course, has been mostly interested in women's rights and the experience of being a woman, particularly vis-a-vis pregnancy and that sort of thing. Although her trajectory, of course, is very different today. But when she was writing those poems, that was what she was, at least in the sets that I'm looking at, was most interested in.
Thank you for that, Chris. Are there any more questions in the bank that need to be forwarded to me? Or okay.
All right.
Any last questions from you all out in around the world? Here, right in front of me.
Go for it. I had one very specific question. I noticed in Teruka's pictures when he depicted geisha that often their head garments had Kaposi sarcoma on them. And I was wondering if there was any meaning to that, because I can't really piece anything together myself.
I have to take a look. I would have to take a look at them. I'm not sure, but let's talk after. I have the art here. We can examine. Yeah. Right.
All right. Well, we really ran a marathon for us.
Yeah. Loved it.
We really appreciate it. Caleb is wanting to compliment you on talk. Great talk, and this is very illuminating. And I think that probably, Caleb, thank you, because I think you have summed it up for all of us there. We are so grateful for you to have made the trip out to Los Angeles. We're grateful to you all who piped in from various places around the country and world for making this a very rigorous Q&A session. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at other Shinso Ito events.
Yeah.
I do want to take the opportunity before I say goodbye to thank Shannon. She's I guess she had to run, for helping facilitate this event, and Nia, our student assistant at the Shinso Ito Center, is on her way to, she's graduating. This is the last event, so thank you for your great contributions as well. And I guess we'll sign off. So thanks very much, everybody.
Great.
Bye now.
Thank you.